at 2 p.m. today. And the second,
this was done over my first piece. I didn't know anything about it. It was conspiracy.
Okay.
Second, that is very honor for us. That is Professor Joseph Nye, member of Board of Thinkers of Boston Global Forum, and this year he lead our issue and great contribution for Boston Global Forum. Have just received very honor medal from Akihito Imperial in Tokyo on November 5, but with order Rising Sun, gold silver, great honor for Professor Sunai. 10 days ago. Boston Global Forum. And Boston Global Forum, we are very honored to we have a great leaders, great contribution for public service, and today also we are very honored with 2 leaders, chair for and moderators for conference today, and we start now with Professor Governor Michael Dukakis, co-founder, the chairman of Boston Global Forum. Yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike Dukakis. I was the governor of Massachusetts for 12 years, tried unsuccessfully to become the president of the United States. And I chair the Boston Global Forum, an organization here in the Boston area which was actually created by Tuan Nguyen, who lives part of the time here, but was actually the founder of the Internet in Vietnam, actively involved as senior editor of the electronic newspaper, which was read by some 6 million people, and who has become a very good friend of many of us. And it was his idea to create something called the Boston Global Forum, which would permit us to tap into some of the really extraordinary talent and intelligence that we have in Boston, and at the same time brought to so many of you all over the world, thanks to the miracle of modern communication and online conferences, and focusing on a particular issue each year. See if we couldn't begin to contribute to the resolution of that issue. We began with international occupational safety and health standards, especially as a result of disasters. And Bangladesh, I'd like to think we contributed something to that, and to much tougher standards which are now for us being enforced and implemented there. But our topic this year involves creating a framework for peace and security in the Pacific. And so that is what we've been focusing on. Is there a way to create a national forum, a framework, and over time, nations in the Pacific to get along with each other, resolve certain differences, avoid the kind of, my judgment at least, rather petty stuff that's been going on in that part of the world in a way that doesn't seem to me to benefit any of the parties to this. So that's been our topic, and today we hope we can explore this very special people that I'll be introducing to you as time goes on. But my co-moderator here is an old friend and a wonderful guy named Jill Barry, who is well public sector here in academia, and we're lucky to have him now as professor at Kennedy School, and he has focused a great deal of his work on the Pacific, on Asia, and continues to do so, and in fact has been honored by the Veterans Government for his contribution. So Joe, I'm going to turn it over to you and ask you to continue our discussion.
Well, thanks, Mike. Let me just say a few words before I turn to your thought or some authority on and elsewhere. But if you look at the rise of China, the question of how we manage the rise of China, by we I mean the world community, is one of the big questions for peace and stability in this century. And there are many areas where we have common interests with China, whether it be trade or monetary stability, climate change, or managing pandemics and so forth. But there are some Where we have one has been the issue of the ocean areas off the coast of China. And that's why we spent a fair amount of time in these earlier sessions of the Boston Global Forum thinking about that. The current dispute between Japan and China over what the Chinese call Diaoyu Islands and the Japanese call the Senkaku Islands has led to situations that could be quite dangerous. The questions about freedom of navigation in the oceans and areas that China's exclusive economic zone, America flies through. There have been accidents there. In 2001, a plane was forced down. A Chinese pilot was killed. RE-3 was forced down, disassembled. There was an incident recently where the Chinese plane did a barrel roll right in front of an American surveillance plane that could easily have created disaster. Japanese and Chinese ships are coming very close to each other in a game of chicken off the islands. And so there is potential for miscalculation, accident, throwing things off course. And Robert Kaplan has written a book, which is a very good book on this. I think he called it The Most Dangerous Sea or something. Cauldron.
Asia's Cauldron.
Asia's Cauldron, that's right. And so the question is, what can we do to avoid this? Is there anything to be done? There's some good news in the sense that despite the way the photograph came out when Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Abe met in China today, that there is at least the beginning of the discussions between China and Japan, which had not been possible before. So we hope for some progress there. But I would argue, and this may run against the conventional wisdom, I would argue that because the U.S. and Japan have dominant military superiority in the East China Sea, I think deterrence is going to work there. When you turn to the South China Sea, I think it's much more problematic because you have many more claimants and you don't have a clear theory of how you deter actions. I was reading a recent paper by Admiral Pivot of the Center for Naval Analysis on the South China Sea. And what he pointed out in this, and I should explain his reasoning on this, is that it would be a huge mistake for the United States to let the South China Sea become a point of principal conflict between the U.S. and China. So we have many interests with China besides the South China Sea. And in addition to that, he said it's not so clear that among the 5 or so countries which are claiming the area of the South China Sea, it's not so clear that the Chinese are almost wrong. And if you get into a situation where it's the U.S. versus China, you can actually become polarized, of course. So, for example, in this paper, he says, policy should not be overwhelming in China. He says that in fact, when you look at the basis of the claims, the overlapping claims among the 5 nations are not clear that the Chinese point is always wrong. And he says the claims of Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei, the islands of rocks, the Spratly Islands, are not as strong as the claim of China or Vietnam. So if we let this get polarized on the U.S.-China dispute, we may be in a difficult situation. What he recommends is essentially that the United States should base its position on international law and codes of conduct, as well as a strong naval presence. And that he recommends the Svalbard sometimes called Spitsbergen Treaty of 1920, as a potential template for creating provisional joint fishing and hydrocarbon protocol. These are interesting ideas, and I guess the point that I want to make is that before we let this escalate into a U.S. versus China point of principle that everything that is done by China is wrong, everything that's done by the other states is right, and we're the maybe for these complaining against China, we should be very careful not to lock ourselves into that. Because it's not so clear what the legal principles are. The American position so far has been we stand for freedom of navigation and base our position on the UN Law of the Sea Treaty, even though ironically we haven't ratified it, which shows that we haven't gotten around to that yet. But the principle is that free navigation under International Law of the Sea Treaty is our stance. The various rocks and shoals and atolls and islands in the South China Sea that are contested by 5 countries, that we've taken the position that we're not taking a position on sovereignty. But we urge these countries to settle this peacefully, and we favor a code of conduct that lead to negotiations. Some will be bilateral, maybe some multilateral. But that we don't want to get locked into a situation where the South China Sea becomes a mini Cold War between the United States and China. And this kind of idea, sticking to the Law of the Sea Treaty, maybe supplementing it with something like the Svalbard Treaty, which Norway shares the resources of this frozen border part is a model of thinking. So that's a way of kicking off the start of how we think about this. But let me turn to Bob, who really knows what he's talking about, because he's written all over it.
Well, thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here with Governor Dukakis and Professor Nye and all of you. Let me start this way. Let me start not in the South China Sea, but in the Caribbean. Because there was a great American-Dutch geopolitical thinker in the 1940s, Nicholas Spikeman, who called the Caribbean the American Mediterranean, because it was so important and critical for the Western Hemisphere. That the Western Hemisphere was not divided between North and South America, but between north of the Amazonian jungle and south of the Amazonian jungle. So that the Caribbean was really the center of the hemisphere. And once the United States, after it settled the continent, it pushed out into the blue water extension of that continent in the greater Caribbean, Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean proper. This was a long process, started in the early 19th century, ended after the beginning of the 20th. And once the United States got control of the Caribbean strategically, it essentially had strategic control of the Western Hemisphere. And with that, it was able to affect the balance of power in the Eastern Hemisphere, and that's what happened in the 20th century. China, I believe, is trying to do something similar with what I call the Asian Mediterranean, being that the South China Sea, with the East China Sea included, is really the heart of the Asia-Pacific maritime Asia. What is China trying? What does the South China Sea mean for China? It's a blue water extension of their continental landmass. If they can take Macau, Hong Kong, essentially economically take outer Mongolia, which they have done. The South China Sea is the natural blue water extension of what they want. The South China Sea also has, and this often goes unstated because it's not a sexy subject, it has enormous amounts of fish protein, a tenth of the whole world, and which China really protects. And the oil and natural gas is disputed in the sense that it's controversial just how much is there. There's a lot of expert opinion that it's been exaggerated, the amount that's there, but it's substantial, however much there is. Also, for the Chinese to essentially deny the American Navy unimpeded access to the to Asia's marginal seas, the East and South China Seas, and have China have a truly multipolar military landscape with the American Navy. We give China's Navy, which is growing and growing, and by Navy I mean land-based ballistic missiles, cyber. Naval is the word naval is sweet for a lot of military areas. It would give China greater access to the outer Pacific, and more importantly, to the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca. If you think of the Strait of Malacca as the Panama, which was done by the United States once it got strategic control of the Greater Caribbean. And I use this metaphor because it was a Chinese senior colonel who said to me, "Why should we act any different in the South China Sea than you Americans acted in the Caribbean?" They know our history very well in terms of the Caribbean. And if through the Strait of Malacca, China would have unimpeded access to the Indian Ocean. And the Indian Ocean is the global energy interstate, across which the oil and natural gas from the Arabian Peninsula and Iranian Plateau goes across to the customers in East Asia, essentially. East Asia being the degree that the world economy has a geographic organizing principle is more East Asia than any other place, so to speak. And so China is developing a great navy, specifically a great submarine force on Hainan Island in the northwestern part of the South China Sea. China has about 63-odd submarines, nuclear and increased, but more importantly, the quietest, most advanced diesel-electric submarines, which are more suited for the coastal water, the noisy coastal waters of the South China Sea. China picks fights with the Philippines because the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States. So by being in some sort of tension with the Philippines, China can poke the Americans in their eye without actually saying so or doing so. This has made Vietnam the latest de facto ally of the United States. The Vietnamese would like a greater American naval air force presence in the region to balance against China. What do we learn from this? I think we learned that East Asia is not so much about ideas as it's about nationalism, zero-sum lines, not in the sand, but in the blue water. Who controls what? Whose territory is what? This was not a problem in the 60s and 70s because the Vietnamese, the Malaysians were involved in internal wars. Japan was in a state of quasi-pacifism emanating from the aftershocks of World War II. China was internally focused, first on Mao's depredation, then on the first decade or two of Deng Xiaoping's new economic mechanism. But now that these countries have really are better institutionalized and are at peace, they're projecting power outwards, and so they tend to come into conflict over who owns what. I don't think this is going to lead to war outside of the possibility of an accident. An incident, rather. I think what it indicates is a more crowded, nervous world, kind of like the conflicts of globalization. Globalization is in some degree all about container traffic. And container ship traffic means navies, to protect sea lines and communication. So you have seas that are more crowded than ever with both warships and merchant ships in some of the busiest sea lines of communication of the world. I think we should not, because of this, we should not take Asian security for granted. In the sense that for too long in the media, war was seen as, oh, that's the Middle East, that's Africa, now it's Ukraine, Asia's about business, essentially. Asia's, I would say, it's about high-end military conflict rather than low-end military conflict. It's about cyber, naval, air, ballistic missiles, because all these countries, now that they're institutionalized better than the 60s and 70s, and this is another lesson, is that sustained capitalist growth leads to military acquisitions. Because think of it, Asia's had decades, a third of the century, 40% of a century of sustained economic growth since the late 70s when the first Pacific Tiger economies emerged. And what have they done with that growth? They're buying weapons. Because that's what tends to happen. You tend to get rich, you tend to develop interests in the outside world that you never had before, you want to defend those interests, prestige enters into it, and suddenly you're acquiring military hardware. I think, finally, the elephant in the room here that often does not get discussed in all discussions about Asian security, maritime conflicts in the South and East China Sea is the Chinese economy. See, there seems to be two separate debates going on about China. One is it's all about the South and East China Sea, naval conflict, the possibility of it. What do the Chinese want? Is there a way to compromise with them? And in this debate, China seems unbeatable. It just gets stronger and stronger, more submarines, more ballistic missiles, etc. Then there's another debate about China's economy. And all the news on that debate tends to be very bleak and negative. Just how big an economic implosion will China have? Will it be dramatic? Will they muddle through over the next decade? And nobody seems to know. Even everyone's hedging their bets outside of a few commentators. And I would say that the degree to which the Chinese economy deteriorates will tell us a lot about this other debate, about China's ability to continue to project more and more power in the South and East China Sea. Because if it's a normal economic contraction, which one would expect after 30 years of dramatic growth, if they can get their growth rate down from 7.5%, ultimately 4 or 5, without great social unrest and massive unemployment, then China will pull through, and I think China could be the dominant power in the Pacific in the decades to come. But what if it's something more dramatic that leads to real dramatic social unrest and political unrest with Turkic Uyghurs in the West, with Tibetans in the Southwest? Could that then make it hard for China to keep projecting global power? I don't have the answer to that, but I do know that the economic debate has to also has to be connected with this strategic debate, and I'll leave it there.
Mike, back to you.
Well, thanks, and it's great to be here, and it's particularly great to be here with friends like Bob and like Joe. I was a student of Joe's, so anything I say here that's wrong is clearly his fault and not mine. So let me just have a few thoughts based on these two. The first is, we would all like to live in a world in which regional institutions had the kind of constraints on the Chinese and everybody else. Like that hasn't happened in Asia. And when I lived in Japan as the Times bureau chief 20 years ago, there were discussions about building an OSCE kind of structure in Asia. And everybody immediately came to the conclusion that wasn't likely to work, just given the nature of the kind of countries and the absences of alliances. And it's even harder to imagine today, because we know that while China has joined many of these institutions, the institutions have changed because of China almost as much as we had expected that the institutions would themselves constrain China. WTO is a really interesting example, where when they joined, and I remember covering the debate about this in the lame duck Senate in 1998, the Clinton administration's argument at that time was bringing China into the WTO would fundamentally change its behavior. And I'm not sure, except around the margins, that that has yet happened. In part, that hasn't happened because when Xi Jinping talks about a new type of great power relations, what he's really talking about is changing the norms and institutions, or at least having as much influence on them as the United States and Britain had when many of these institutions were set up in World War II or prior to that. And, you know, the Chinese students study the Spanish-American War more carefully than almost any other period in American history, and it's not for nothing. You know, Joe and our colleague Graham Allison and I all like to fish up in sections of Alaska that were neatly taken by the United States, particularly along the Canadian border, in an act that the Chinese could only admire today and are clearly trying to replicate. So how do you create this sort of culture of dialogue that the document setting up today's event described when you have at least one power that is out there to go change the nature of the norms? Well, we have a few interesting test cases. The islands, of course, are one of them, and that's all been covered. Bob made brief reference to cyber, and that's another fascinating one because it's an area where there aren't many norms right now. And President Obama's early efforts to force the Chinese into sort of discussing them, most recently when they met at the summit meeting 17 months ago in California, basically, at least on the first pass, didn't result in much. And that's why the United States went ahead and indicted 3 members of Unit 61398 back in June, not because they ever thought that these guys would ever show up in the inside of an American court, which I don't think they ever will, unless they decide to take their kids to Disneyland or something like that, but instead because they thought this would sort of jolt the Chinese into a real conversation. At least so far as I can tell, it hasn't had that effect. It may, but the initial reaction was to sort of cut off dialogue, and one of the interesting results that we should be looking for, I know we are looking for this week with the president in Beijing, is whether or not you begin to see that dialogue get restored. But it's an interesting first test because it is, as Harper pointed out, one of these high-end areas of conflict, and at the second, in the second order, it's an example of where we can set norms where right now there aren't many norms. So it doesn't get into that issue that the Chinese have of trying to alter norms that were set in a discussion they weren't involved in initially. It also means getting accustomed to the use of routinized Chinese presence elsewhere around the world where we haven't seen them. So we all applauded their showing up to combat piracy off Somalia. And that was sort of the first big out-of-area but in their interests element. Now we've seen one of those submarines that you just heard about go through and do a tour of the Persian Gulf. So we believe it did from American military sources. And we're likely in the next 6 months to a year to see the first nuclear-armed submarine take a big, long loop. That will certainly revitalize a group that wanted to work toward containment of Chinese military power when George Bush came into power. And 9/11 sort of threw them off of their agenda, and they ended up focusing that energy on Iraq. That worked out fine. And now you're beginning to hear that group sort of come back a little bit as the Chinese are significantly more capable. But I think the hardest part of this is going to be balancing, on the one hand, a common definition of this new type of great power relations. And if you haven't seen it, Jane Perlez has a really interesting piece in today's Times on how President Obama and President Xi view that phrase differently, with our effort to make sure that the Chinese are, as Joe has told us many times, self-containing in some of their power. There are some acts that they would probably like to take at some point that they simply can't because they would blow up on them. That's why you don't hear very much these days about people warning that the Chinese would go liquidate their holdings in U.S. Treasuries, which obviously they can't do without devaluing many of their own holdings. And so I think the trick here is figuring out how to leverage that self-containment concept that Joe has taught all of us, and how to make the most of that. It's not going to work in the South China Sea. It may work in the East China Sea for the reasons that Joe laid out. And how to get the country, the United States, accustomed to the fact that we are going to see the Chinese in many parts of the world now where we've never seen them before.
Can we just...
Okay, you want to go to Singapore to get a view from that part of the world with Professor Soligen, and if we can...
Can you hear me?
Gotcha.
Can you hear me? Hello, good morning. Greetings from Singapore. Can you hear me?
Yes, 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 loud and clear.
Okay, I could barely hear the conversation here, so I hope I come through. It's early morning here, and my jet lag will show the broad context, where we've been, where we are, and what's happening now, as I see it. Following the wars of the mid-20th century, there have been no major wars in East Asia for several decades now. Yes, persistent historical, ethnic, religious, and territorial cleavages lingered, but disputes were restrained for most of these periods, and major powers normalized diplomatic relations, something that we now take for granted. At the time, military expenditures over this period did not undermine macroeconomic and regional stability, and indeed such expenditures declined as a percentage of GDP. In addition, intra and extra-regional trade and investment expanded dramatically. So what were the foundations of this peaceful development? And now I hope to address a little bit of the elephant in the room that Mr. Kaplan, I think, mentioned. The underlying foundations of China's political economy. Well, the underlying foundations, of course, include the U.S. role as a vital component, but I'd like to focus on another crucial source of restraint that operated over that period. And that is the standard internationalizing model that most states in this region adopted in terms of advancing economic growth through engagement in the global economy. The dominant incentives of leaders advancing those, I'll call, internationalizing strategies were granting primacy to macroeconomic stability, to all those things that are beneficial to foreign investment. Another incentive was to promote regional economic and security institutions to buttress the expansion of intra and extra-regional trade and investments. But these institutions were of the open regionalism kind. I'll come back to this point in a second. A third goal of these leaders was to maintain a stable regional environment that would not compel expansive military budgets, because such expenditures deficits affect foreign investments. All those incentives compelled the taming of territorial, maritime, and history disagreements. Relations between China and Japan, Vietnam, South Korea, ASEAN, etc., were not necessarily built on harmony, but on the recognition that all must adjust policies and restrain unilateralism. Of course, lingering issues of memory and history remained, but they did not preclude economic, political, and diplomatic reconciliations. China's charm offensive, in particular, required a peaceful rise, a new matrix of regional relations, more mature relations with neighbors, a new openness to regional and multilateral institutions, etc. Now, this evolution took over in the last few years. We're all painfully familiar with what happened. A more intrusive presence from nationalistic, inward-looking forces in several countries that eroded cooperation and undermined the dominant internationalizing model. The result we're all familiar with: more aggressive vigilance over territorial disputes, overlapping air defense identification zones that replaced restraint and mature diplomacy, claims over islands and rocks, hardened alliances, more aggressive forms of nationalism, more negative views of neighbors, more exclusionary regional institutions, more unilateralist behavior rather than agreed codes of conduct, and more military modernization with offensive overtones. Now, these changes reflect both domestic pressures from inward-looking constituencies and contagious diffusion, so that one country's nationalism strengthened nationalism in neighboring countries in spiral fashion. And these dynamics made it harder to restore the previous internationalizing equilibrium. Obviously, visits to Yasukuni Shrine were one instance of spiraling action-reaction conflict behavior, and a proneness to brinkmanship of the kind we've seen in the last couple of years lowered the, leading to some comparisons with World War I, even if, in my view, some of these comparisons can be overdone. So where are we now? Though they remain threatened by inward-looking nationalism, internationalizing models have not become extinct in this part of the world. There are some signs that leaders have recalculated the costs of confrontation, leaders on all sides. As an example, some of the costs of confrontation, Japan's FDI, foreign direct investment, decreased dramatically, maybe half in 2014, and all sides suffered from diminished economic exchange and exacerbated. The recent understanding between China and Japan and the handshake between the two leaders have been preceded by a number of efforts to de-escalate their dispute since last summer. But the road ahead, I'm sorry, I'm getting a lot of echo here. The road ahead, I think, requires that leaders coordinate a lot better against those internal and external enemies. And such enemies include not just hyper-nationalism or North Korea, another anachronism in the region, but also the possibility of downturn economic spirals that can make regional relations or regional tensions even more acute. The beneficiaries of it would be those inward-looking constituencies in each country that, in my view, would increase the likelihood of armed conflict. So East Asian leaders must focus the mind on the fact that their populations strongly favor economic exchange. A Pew Research Center poll shows 86% of the public across 11 Asian states think trade is a good thing for their country, and it shows that 89% of Chinese people describe their economic situation as good, as benefiting from economic expansion. Well, surely those benefits are creating an Asia-Pacific dream for the people of the region, in the words of President Xi Jinping yesterday. Well, those benefits are incompatible with aggressive nationalism. But just to end, a common purpose to prevent shared threats requires, I think, sustained openness, inclusive rather than exclusionary institutions, shared codes of conduct, arrangements, and much more. The U.S. can play a constructive role in these efforts, but all East Asian leaders must treat nationalism as an infectious disease that may not be completely eradicated, inert. Nationalism does never bolster legitimacy. It entraps leaders. It can lead to their demise, as both Japan and Germany learned in the 20th century. Leaders of the 20th century have the 21st century have the duty to look back to and to avoid the catastrophes visited on the world on the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, very much. John, I know you gave us a little bit on the early side, so I wonder if you'd take a few minutes and respond to that and perhaps develop your thoughts about it.
Let me just try to pull together things that Bob and David and Ethel have said. If you look at China as a rising power and you compare it to the United States, I'm somebody who believes that the United States is still going to be more powerful than China, say, in the next 30 years. There are a lot of people who think that China is passing us. I don't think so. I'm writing a book now called Is the American Century Over? And if the century started with Henry Luce's proclamation in 1941, the question is, will China be more powerful than the U.S. in 2041? And I think not. I think they have a very impressive record, but I don't see them becoming more powerful overall than the United States. It's a little bit different from Germany passing Britain at the time of World War I. Germany had already become more powerful economically than Britain by 1900. China is not about to. There'll be larger total size of their gross domestic product, but not in per capita income, which is a measure of the sophistication of the economy. They won't catch up to us by 2041, if then. So the point is that we have time to manage this relationship. And the great danger is if we succumb to fear and let us forget that this is a situation we can manage. People look at China, and in a global sense, China is not a revisionist state. It's not trying to take over the system. David's right when he says that China has done well out of the WTO. That's why they don't want to take over the WTO. And where China is a revisionist country, which wants to change the framework, is in the South China Sea and East China Sea, which Bob referred to, and for the reasons that he gave. The question then is, can we do something to prevent that happening? And the answer is yes. A strong American naval presence would make a huge difference, A, and B, we can start trying to develop things that are in China's interest if we put the right menu in front of them. And that's the type of things I was referring to from Mike McDivitt's paper, which is we can strengthen Vietnam, the Philippines, and others with defense assistance. We can push hard for a code of conduct. We can emphasize the international law of the sea consensus. And we can try to support things like a Svalbard type joint exploration. After all, in 2008, Japan and China had an agreement for joint exploration of natural gas, which unfortunately didn't last. But there are things we can do other than just succumb to a little Cold War there. So my argument is the problems that we've discussed, whether they're the global economic problems or the problems in the region of China trying to exclude us from the area, I think we can manage those. And the East China Sea, which I mentioned earlier, there it's covered by the U.S.-Japan Security Treaty, and everybody, including the President, has said that. And I think deterrence will work in that area. I think the East China Sea is pretty clear. South China Sea is manageable, but we have to make sure that we don't get so fearful that we make a mess of something which actually could be managed. I mean, so those would be my thoughts of wrapping the different thoughts together. But we have Patrick Cronin and Michio Futsuzaki coming, and I'd be interested to hear their thoughts.
Well, let's go to Patrick.
Well, thank you. Can you hear me clearly? I want to underscore that I agree with everything Joe and I just said, but in sharing the research that we're doing here at the Center for New American Security, we are focused on one dimension of what we think is a solution for U.S. policy and for allied and partner policy. If we think about the U.S.-China relationship as everything from building mutual respect, as we see with Sunnyland's 2 summit meeting in Beijing, to building transparency, to building confidence-building measures, and hopefully binding rules, not also a code of conduct. We're also interested in the U.S. policy on the harder end of the spectrum. And Joe and I just asked the question, can we do anything in the South China Sea beyond what we've been doing? So if we looked at U.S. policy of rebalancing to the Asia-Pacific in general as largely ways to cooperate with China, rising China, while managing competition, especially trying to avoid unnecessary competition, whether in cyberspace or in the maritime domain, how do we, in the meantime, we're trying to build that cooperation on areas where we do not agree, how do we strengthen our own position, protect our own interests, and strengthen the position and interests of allies and partners? So we've been looking at something called cross-imposition strategy. And this is a question that goes beyond what we've already talked about. We talked about deterrence working, especially in the East China Sea, and I agree with that. The question is, do we need compelling? Do we need dissuasion? Do we need the ability to do more than deter conflict, but rather to do something that imposes costs on inappropriate action, an action that basically can be considered unilateral changes to the status quo? We've called it various strategies, tactic strategies, salami tactics, incremental encroachment of sovereignty, whatever you call these incremental steps, whether it's the declaration of the 9-dash line or 10-dash line of China, whether it's the moving of oil rigs into disputed water, whether it's the harassment of aircraft or ships, whether it's the land reclamation of rocks into artificial islands, whether it's any of those and more, can we impose costs? Should we impose costs on those actions? Now, I do take the caveat Joe and I mentioned at the outset that, in quoting Mike McDevitt, that it's not that China is always wrong, and that's certainly not the claim here. China is the biggest actor that's changing the status quo, especially in the status quo, and in the South China Sea, but also in the East China Sea. In addition to Bob Kaplan's outstanding book, we have now the recent edition of Bill Hayton's book, The South China Sea, which does a wonderful job at looking at the early history and essentially the fact that sovereignty in these maritime domains, frankly, are very contemporary issues. Now, we're looking at U.S. policy. U.S. policy has been detecting a pattern of greater Chinese assertiveness, especially since 2009, say, when the Chinese extended that 9-dash line to the United Nations Commission on the limits of the continental shelf. Bill Hayton talks about the earlier period under Mao with the paracels in 1974, or in Johnson's South Reef in 1988, or Mr. Reef in 1995. All three of those were military incidents that the Chinese undertook to expand their influence and control over the South China Sea, well before the recent pattern of assertiveness we've seen. So, again, not to put all the onus on China, but looking at the tough issues that we're facing with China in this maritime space, what can we do? Well, in an initial paper that I put out as part of a year-long project that we're conducting, I put together a broad framework of everything that's realistic as well as just theoretical that might be done. But let me just focus on the categories that are maybe more realistic. The reputation costs are what we've been mostly focused on. And so when there's an action that is assertive, whether it's by China or another country, just trying to put the spotlight on those actions is very important for reputational costs. And we've been using the major diplomatic arenas in the region, like the ASEAN Regional Forum or the East Asia Summit, to try to impose those costs. But nobody really thinks that China, if it's really determined to expand its influence, to basically rewrite the facts on the ground in the sea and the air, is going to be dissuaded by reputational costs alone. They may change their tactics temporarily, as they did with the movement of the oil rig this summer, but they're likely to go back to probing opportunities, just as we saw with 74, 88, and 1995, when there was a missed, when there was an opportunity, the Chinese didn't miss the opportunity to go ahead and exert their exercise of force. So we're looking for other things. We obviously would like to create codes of conduct and confidence-building measures, but so far the Chinese have only been willing to sign up to non-binding and voluntary codes, like the Qs, the Code of Unplanned Encounters at Sea that they earlier announced, which didn't go any further than they were already basically signed up to under international shipping laws, the coal regs. We've also tried to have military-to-military talks, and we've been building confidence by making sure that our navies and our militaries are talking closely. These are welcome steps, good steps, but as Admiral Harry Harris told me just a few weeks ago, when Admiral Wu, his counterpart, said, "Look, we want to have a real hotline so that we can avoid having an incident between the U.S. and the Chinese Navy at sea." And Admiral Harris said, "Well, that's great, but in the past you haven't answered your phone, so I've got an idea. Why don't we just exchange mobile numbers, cell phone numbers?" And Admiral Wu was taken aback. The reason he was taken aback is because he doesn't represent an individual actor. He doesn't have the capacity to act on the part of the PLA or the CPC to take that action, whereas Admiral Harris could reasonably be given the ability to have a phone call with his counterpart just to exchange information as an incident occurred or maybe tensions were escalating. So structurally, we have problems in building these confidence-building measures. So in the meantime, there's going to be some competition. One of the things we can do is obviously build transparency. And there's a growing proliferation of intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance imagery. But this imagery doesn't have 24/7 eyes on all of even the South China Sea or the East China Sea. So we're still going to see opportunistic videos on YouTube of ramming of ships and of satellite photos and aircraft photos, surveillance of the land reclamation. But getting that information out in public, debating it, is a healthy step toward making sure that whatever actions individual countries are taking is at least debated within the region with more awareness. The United States is also doing what Joe and I mentioned, which is building partnership capacity. So we're working along with Japan and others to build the Coast Guard as well as the naval and air capacity and air defense capacity of partners, allies like the Philippines, partners like Vietnam. But we're also trying to build region-wide agreement on some of these issues. The problem with region-wide architecture in Asia is that nobody agrees on what the architecture ought to be. And we have these overlapping institutions already that take up so much time and attention for this tsunami of summits that are happening right now and over the next week. The problem is that there's some really good ideas out there. There's one idea in Japan, for instance, talking about an OSCE for the maritime space. And you can imagine it broken down not into the classic human rights and military and political dimensions, but rather looking at the different dimensions of maritime cooperation, such as oil, energy, research, search and rescue, but also dealing with code of conduct so that there won't be dangerous incidents in the air or the sea. Right now, that's what we're worried about. We're worried not about the high end of war breaking out so much as these gray zones erupting into escalation of tension because we don't have any means of control. We don't have any means of persuading, especially the Chinese, but not just the Chinese, from taking steps that are dangerous. So I'll stop there with that research, other than to say that we plan to come out with a policy report in next March with policy recommendations. We're continuing our series of workshops, and we have a website where we're publishing regular papers. We have 2 more papers about to go up on the website on cost imposition strategy, but also a paper that documents actions of China and the claimants in the South China Sea that have been taken in recent years. It's a very interesting matrix, all empirical, done by Dr. Christopher Young at the National Defense University. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Patrick. Interesting thoughts here. I have a few questions of my own, but I'd like to go to Dick Rosecrans first, then Suzanne Ogden.
Governor, come in.
What you've been doing so far. Dick, why don't we start with you?
Well, I'm a little bit buffaloed by everything, I must confess, because on the one hand, the underlying potential is fundamentally specific, at least if one believes that the world economy will stick together with reasonable Chinese growth rates, reasonable American growth rates, and so on. The worst possible thing would be to unravel that American economy, that international economy by virtue of things that happen in East Asia. And that would be the tail wagging the dog, and I think no one wants to see that again. On the other hand, the basic conclusion that we reached in our book, which I shouldn't advertise, but as long as it just happens to be here, I'll hold it up. The basic conclusion that we reached in the book, which Joe and Graham and others contributed profoundly, was that little things can sometimes make a big difference, even when the overarching sort of underlying agreement on peace is very strong, or at least quite strong. No one wants to say that Germany did not want to improve its position. Of course it did. The real question is, how far should it go in doing that, and was giving a blank check to Austria to humiliate Serbia the best way of doing that. I think a little bit greater reflection on the part of Kaiser and Holbein would have indicated an entirely different outcome to that conclusion. And remember that it was only a few days later that the Kaiser did vary from his assumed blank check and try to get the Austrians to hold back. So there was a lot of very ineffective, short-term, and small issue kind of calculations. Could we have issues of those sorts in Asia? Yes, we definitely could. And in fact, one of the things that is most worrisome about what's going on locally in the South China Sea, if not the East China Sea, is that the locals don't seem to be capable of handling it. And if the locals cannot handle it, then it forces the bigger powers to become involved. That means the United States. And that means an escalation, obviously, of whatever kind. So if each one of these powers, maybe with our help, had strong coastal vessels and abilities to prevent escalation because of the inequalities of local forces on the spot, then I think it would be much less worrisome that it would escalate to involve Japan, the United States, China, and so on. It is crucial that we build up the military forces of Vietnam, for example. It is crucial that we make sure that the Philippines has adequate coastal vessels, which it certainly does not have now. I think if we're going to keep this limited, we have to make sure that as far as possible, it is the locals that will be able to handle it with our help, our background help, but not as a primary venture by us or the Japanese or China to come in and sort of carry all the weight. So I am actually not as upset by the current arrangements, even though I think they have to be strengthened in ways. Because even if there are some imbalances in power, the question is, what is the usability of force? It's true, small little coastal vessels can use force. But do we want to see submarines then suddenly firing on aircraft carriers? I think that is very, very unlikely. I mean, the last thing the Chinese would do, even if they could, would be to sink a U.S. aircraft carrier. So that even if there are slight imbalances at the strategic level, those don't seem to me to be too likely to lead to escalation, because the consequences of doing so would be so overwhelming that both powers would hold back. And then they would find having the cell phone of the other guy being very, very helpful. And I know you all heard the story that David Elwood tells from time to time again about the Chinese, about the Soviet submarine that was in trouble and managed to pull a nearby vessel. And of course, the nearby vessel was an American vessel, and it turned out the commander of the Russian submarine was in trouble, and the commander of the possible savior destroyer had both been in the same Kennedy School class in 1982. And so it was possible for them to talk about these matters and get things resolved, even without consulting higher authority on either side. This is the kind of thing we want beyond the locals to be able to handle matters themselves insofar as that's possible.
Governor,
Let's go to Suzanne, and then
Governor,
she gives us her own thoughts on this. I know our friends in Japan have been standing by for some time as well. Suzanne, this notion of China is kind of a bad word. It's going to be disciplined. It strikes me as even engaging in conflict with the United States is engaging in time to time. The Chinese have surveillance aircraft patrolling a few miles off the west coast of Florida. There'd be an uproar in Washington. So, give us your own thoughts. It's a long time to China. What's your sense of this? How do we move in a way that minimizes this kind of stuff and creates a framework for international understanding?
I think it's a nicely put question. I think we often see things from our perspective and don't see it from the Chinese perspective, and there's a huge amount of sort of hypocrisy in all of this, imagining they shouldn't feel the same way we would feel in similar conditions. But I did just want to pick up on two things that were said that I think just could be looked at in a different way. One is that David Sanger raised the question of the concern possibly of a nuclear-armed submarines, many of them perhaps being developed by the Chinese. And going back to the rhetoric of deterrence, the assumption is mutual assured destruction. That means that to have mutual assured destruction, you must have a second strike capability on both sides. And if the basis of the U.S. Mutual assured destruction during the Cold War was our submarine capacity, because it is mobile, it's very hard to hit. So this is how we had a second strike capability. So now we, in a sense, want China to feel it has a second strike capability. It is actually very dangerous for a country to feel that we have a first strike capability against it. And I think if you could look at the situation where they're developing nuclear armed submarines as a positive, that now they will feel confident, they don't have to worry about the United States attacking them, because we will know that they'll have a second strike capability. The only other point I'd like to make is that any predictions about China's collapse or its economy collapsing in a sense that it's worse than, say, 2008 was for us, that they can't handle it. These predictions are made at just the rate at which the predictions are made that the U.S. stock market is going to collapse. And I think we of course always have to think about this, but we shouldn't premise policy on the belief that the Chinese economy is really in a lot of trouble. The Chinese economists are very smart. They know what they're doing, and they're taking very rational measures to keep the economy chugging along. Of course, it can always have a major crisis that results in a disaster, but as each year goes on, it seems less and less likely.
Thanks.
Can we add some books from Turkey?
Some coming together between China and Japan, de-escalate.
Governor.
And I wonder if our friends in Japan can
Yeah,
some sense of how they view this, whether or not it's just a temporary thing, or whether it represents
can we add some voice from Turkey?
more long term. And
Governor?
after what we've been seeing for a while here, a recognition on the part of both China and Japan that makes a lot
Can
more
we
sense.
add some views from Turkey?
Governor. Governor.
Go ahead, Rock.
Hi, Governor. This is Tokyo.
Right.
Let us, get into the discussion. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right.
Can we add some views from Tokyo?
That's exactly what we're looking for.
Okay.
Okay. First, congratulations, Joe, for the decoration. I was in Beijing. I came back from 2 days ago, and I was very impressed with the blue sky there. Now, Japan, China, I think China was waiting for this occasion. 3 reasons. The investment into China was dropping, not only from Japan, but from Europe, EU. Second reason, they had all the troubles with, not only with us, Vietnam, Philippines, and they wanted to improve the environment. Third, I think your policy of backing us in East China Sea was very effective. So April's President Obama's statement, I think, had some effect as well. However, having said that, we shouldn't have any euphoria. As Abe-san said, this is only one step. And they discussed tried to discuss the avoiding accidents, but in reality, if their intention is different, then we have to be always careful. Comments on what Joe Nye said. One, as for the South China Sea, 2 things are imperative. One, to fortify Philippine bases, American bases. And second, support the ASEAN Code of Conduct. As for revisionists, if China is revisionist or not, as Joe said, I think the very point is where they are strong, they will never become, they don't have to become revisionist, like WTO. But when they are not that strong, they may take that view. It's not only South China Sea, but look at Asia financial situation. They came up with idea like AIIB. So it's sort of more generalized thing rather than just one area. Third, I agree with Joe that China will never take up the leader role. It's not only military and economic, but it's because of your founding fathers' principles of values. No country would follow China's values in that region. So I think that's the most important part. As for what Dr. Kaplan said, Caribbean Sea, but they may use that logic, but look at we have to look at the time. And you did not allow Germany or Japan to use the logic of France, Britain, and Dutch of colonialism. So I think it's rather strange that you would listen to this logic of China using the American metaphor. Lastly, people here in Japan, some of them are concerned. Well, I should not be concerned. Let's use the word concerned, but be interested. After the midterm election, usually the second-term presidents have little power over Congress to move some domestic politics. They turn to diplomacy. Middle East becomes target, but then nothing moves because of Israeli position, and then they turn to Asia. Then some Clinton, Bush used North Korea, and we were wondering if such something that might come up like with China or North Korea could happen in next 2 months. If it's in a good direction, we welcome it. I think a close consultation is needed. Thank you very much, and I would like to ask my friend Kondo-san.
Hi, it's great to be a part of VGF once again. I think we have to clearly distinguish vis-a-vis China what we should do in the short term and what we should in the long term. What we can do in the short term is to demonstrate a strong resolve not to let them breach international norms. And also, we have to remind China that they are part of P5 with permanent seats in the Security Council that have a strong responsibility to maintain and protect the Charter of the United Nations. I'm saying this because a student of mine, I'm teaching at Doshisha University in Kyoto, who spent 12 years in China and now back in Japan and be a student, told me that many Chinese are wondering which way to go further to seek for a hegemony, to stop their hair, and seek for a sort of virtuous great power which will be respected by the rest of the world. So we can appeal to their pride. They are not simple people, so we can do this. And in the long run, of course, we have to use soft power. And one good proposal I have is to establish a student exchange program like Erasmus program in Europe, which is very successful. Once I made a survey comparing the number of students who have been to other countries in the region, and the ratio was 10 to 1. I mean, in East Asia, only 1/10 of the students go to universities of other countries. And also, it's a one-sided flow. Students from Southeast Asia to Japan, China, and to some extent to Korea, and no the other way around, and no sort of vertical, horizontal moves from Vietnam to Myanmar or Indonesia to Thailand. So we can introduce Erasmus-style sort of effective exchange program, because according to one of the latest reliable opinion polls, 93.3% of Chinese have never been to Japan, and 85.7% of Japanese have never been to China. We are so close neighbors, but this clearly shows that people exchange will eventually ease the tension, and we can easily postpone some issues because we always concentrate on emergency issues. But if we keep postponing long-term issues, we'll never get there. So I think I have to seriously think about start of exchange program. Thank you. And no. Okay.
Thank you so much. We're getting close to the end, but I'd love to go back to Bob Kaplan, and then David to you, and get some thought about how we go, and in particular, what you think the Boston Global Forum can do to play a constructive role in this process.
I think every go over 4 points. One is that is a part of the world, particularly where American hard power. It's not it's not the where American hard power in the last decade is discredited in the eyes of some or many. Asia, American hard power is seen as a stabilizing force. The second thing is that, and this leads from the first, is that it's a different world with a 250-ship American Navy than with a 300-ship American Navy. These are just numbers to many people, but it really is a different world. A world with 220, 250-ship American Navy, I would bet, is a world that's far more unstable than even the one we have now. That's even more likely to have conflicts between regional powers than the one we have now. I think, however, that China would like to ascend militarily in the region, but without ever having to fire a shot, and particularly never having to get into a shooting war, even of 1 day's duration, with the United States. Because China is very they're very realistic. They know that they're 20, pick a decade, 20, 30 years behind the U.S. Navy. Naval power is not just about buying ships. It's about being able to use them with 300-man crews of young people on each destroyer or submarine and 5,000 on an aircraft carrier. This takes a generation or two of seamanship to really develop, and China is just not there yet. So China would like to ascend by making an end run around Taiwanese sovereignty, by just encroaching slowly, but without ever getting into a conflict with the United States. And finally, that leaves the United States. The United States has to steer between two parameters. On the one hand, it should not let China, in one fashion or another, Finlandize countries like Vietnam or the Philippines and Malaysia. But on the other hand, the United States should not let its alliances with the Philippines or its de facto alliance with Vietnam and Malaysia to allow the United States to slip into a real conflict with China. Because the U.S.-China relationship is simply too important to the world. So that it's so important that the United States cannot afford to get into any sort of military conflict with China because of some dispute in the Spratly Islands or something like that. So it's a matter of steering between these two extremes. And I think that, the Boston Global Forum or any forum, in that sense, has to emphasize two things. Don't go to extremes, but American hard naval power to a reasonable extent is necessary, particularly in East Asia.
David, you agree with that? Disagree with that?
Well,
where should we be going? All right.
Bob threw me off. The usual Harvard rule is 3 points, and he did 4, and now I've got to go magic. But fortunately, I came up with a 4. So the first one is the pivot's got to be executed. It has been enunciated very well. The rationale is there, but a failure to execute on it would be seen by the Chinese and everybody else in the region as the U.S. doing a very slow retreat.
Can I stop you for a second? Because I still don't understand the pivot.
Okay.
What is it? What is it supposed to do?
So the main thing it's supposed to do is move the center of balance of American diplomacy and American military presence to the Pacific, roughly 60% of both. Okay.
Why?
And the why is very important, because the why here is that if you're going into the Pacific in a time of crisis, in one of those small flare-ups that Bob pointed out, you're in a very different situation where you seem to be intruding into a scene than you are if you are routine. You're always going through the East China and the South China Sea, so that it doesn't look like, as you build up there, that you are doing anything provocative. The routine is critical. And along the way, we've got to accept the fact that the Chinese are routinely going to be in areas where we haven't seen them before. That's the other side of the bargain.
And you want to talk about that a little bit, because it sounds to me as if what we're objecting to is a China that begins to do a lot more of the kind of stuff that we do.
Which, in many ways, I think we should welcome. Right? What's the complaint that you hear from President Obama every time that we have to send troops in against ISIL or go do a humanitarian relief as we did in Syria or whatever? He's like, where are the Chinese? Why are we doing all of this, and yet they keep talking about losing global power? So we want to accept the fact that they take what I mentioned before, the piracy efforts, and spread that out. It wouldn't be a bad thing if we saw them helping to contain the Iranian nuclear program. If we saw them
doing that a bit.
They're doing it a bit by cutting back on their purchases, although they also surged forward in the spring. They cut back again on it. I mean, they do it in very selective modes. You want to get them routinized, but if we're not in Asia on a very regular and accelerated basis, then when we go in, our chances of having a confrontation as we go in are a lot greater. Okay, so it's a way of deconflicting. The second part is, and this is going to be the hardest one between the president and his own party, is if you don't have basic deals like TPP go through, which shouldn't be all that complicated, then you're not going to be able to keep up with the interregional deals and with the element of this we just alluded to, which is Putin and Xi have seen a commonality of interests between themselves, and you don't want to be sort of left on the sidelines of that. A third point is that here in the United States we have to avoid what Graham Allison wonderfully calls the Thucydides trap element of this, that our fear of China's rise ends up driving our policy instead of looking at the self-containment that I discussed before. And avoiding the fear means talking about China's rise in the political dialogue here. And boy, that is hard for any candidate, whether they are a Democrat or a Republican or a Martian, because it makes it sound like you are saying that American exceptionalism is not going to be as great in the future as it has been in the past 50 or 100 years. And the answer to that is American exceptionalism is not going to be as great in the future as it has been in the past 50 or 100 years. And the interesting thing about President Obama is I think he's one of the first presidents who's perfectly comfortable with that, but has discovered the risk of saying so in public. A fourth thing, and we're well on our way to it today, and it's something that the Boston Forum, Global One, can help with, and many other groups, including 100,000 Strong and others. The President and President Xi agreed today to a 10-year visa for business, tourists, and for students. That is more than just a 10 times increase in what the current rule is. It means that as a business, you can plan for a long-term presence. It means if you're a Chinese student coming here, you're not worried that as soon as you graduate from Harvard or some other place, you're going to pick up and go back right away. We're going to get them to stay in graduate school longer. We're going to get them to stay in the workforce longer. That's exactly what we want to encourage. You know, and
what does it tell you about the Chinese? I mean, the willingness to do it?
Well, it tells you a little bit about more of a sense of security than we've seen there before. The earlier concern from the Chinese side was a brain drain side concern, right? That students would come here and then stay and all that. So the short visa helped bring them back, gave them a chance to have their hopes back in them. They have plenty of hopes in them because they've got family, you know, back home. But, you know, Tom Friedman used to have this great phrase that he would use in many of his columns, which was, if you were a foreign student and you came here and you went through the trouble of getting an advanced graduate degree, we had to learn how to staple the green card to your diploma on your way up to the stage. Right? And it's exactly what we need to do, because if you do that, you're going to retain a lot of this talent. And that means getting over an awful lot of phobias that we have at our end. This is at the very high end of the job market. It's not down in day labor territory. It's exactly what we want. Our Japanese friends are still on with us, and when I lived in Japan, I would often talk about Andy Grove, the founder of Intel, who left Hungary during the revolution in 1956, and he had to decide where he was going to settle. And he settled in the United States and learned English by reading the New York Times, and went to NYU and ended up going off to found Intel, and with it the blooming of the semiconductor. Had Japan had an open immigration system, it's very possible that Andy Grove, or a generation later, found Google, would have come and settled in Japan. And Japan would have been at the forefront instead of catching up on the chip. They ended up doing very well in networks, not as well in microprocessors. or in Google search engines or something like that. We have to come look at this as a competitive strength of ours, that we bring in immigrants and bring in these ideas, and we have to look at China that way. And Japan would be wise to do the same thing, because their immigration policies ended up, I think, shaving many points of GDP off of GDP for the past 20 years. And we should learn from their lessons.
Food for thought. I want to thank all of you, those of you here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, friends in Singapore, Japan, and Washington. Our hope is that out of this discussion, we can create in some way an advisory group, a council Pacific, broadly representative that can, in whatever way possible, help the greatest friends. It will minimize the risks and maximize the kind of spirit that seems to be reflected at least today here in the President, both China and the United States. And we're just very grateful to all of you for being with us and sharing thoughts and ideas with us, and we can work with you and lots of others and make a real contribution to this. So my thanks to you, and my thanks to all of you who are participating with us around the world. We look forward to continuing this effort. I want to thank Tom Patterson, our host of Insurance to the Center, welcoming us in, creating rooms, and helping to build a better and more peaceful industry. Thanks, David.